There are truths so hazardous that they can only be uttered in a whisper. And sometimes, even whispering is too loud. So instead, people turn to other methods, methods that require no spoken words, methods that remain inaudible to others, methods that appear meaningless to anyone unfamiliar with their hidden language. And sometimes, two hands clasped together seem to show nothing more than sisterly affection. For over 150 years, a photograph sat in an archive, catalogued, preserved, occasionally viewed by researchers piecing together records from the Civil War era. The image showed two young black women seated side by side in a Philadelphia photographer's studio. Their posture was formal, their expressions calm, their fingers intertwined in a way that anyone would take for a simple gesture of love between sisters. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing demanding a second look. Until someone finally gave it one. In 2013, a curator used modern digital technology to enlarge the image and noticed something that stopped her cold. The positioning of their fingers. It wasn't accidental, it wasn't casual. It was intentional, specific, encoded. Concealed in plain sight for 150 years was a message so carefully hidden that generations of historians passed it by without ever realizing it existed. If you want to discover what these two women were truly communicating to each other, and to us, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, because what you're about to learn will forever change how you see history. Dr. Evelyn Harper had worked at the Boston Museum of African American History for nearly 8 years when an anonymous donation arrived. It came in a worn cardboard box postmarked from Philadelphia, with no return address and only a brief handwritten note tucked inside, *, these belong to my grandmother. I think they matter, *. Inside were 17 daguerreotypes, tintypes, and early paper photographs, most showing black families and individuals from the 1850s through the 1880s. Over the years, Evelyn had seen hundreds of similar collections. Most were family portraits, records of lives lived during and after slavery, precious but ultimately unremarkable in their composition. She logged each image into the museum's database with careful attention, noting approximate dates, clothing styles, and studio backdrops where visible. She was methodical, professional, patient. Then she reached the 9th photograph in the stack. Two women seated together, sisters, clearly. Their resemblance was unmistakable in the structure of their faces and the shape of their eyes. The older one wore her hair pulled back severely, her dress high-necked and formal. The younger had softer features but the same intensity in her gaze. Their hands were clasped together between them, resting on the older sister's lap. Evelyn nearly moved on, but something made her pause. She couldn't say what at first, just an instinct, a sense that there was something deliberate about the composition. She picked up her digital scanner and carefully positioned the daguerreotype on the glass surface. The machine hummed softly as it captured the image in high resolution, translating the faded sepia tones into sharp digital clarity. When the file appeared on her computer screen, Evelyn leaned closer, zooming in on various details, the studio backdrop, the fabric of their dresses, and then the hands. The fingers weren't simply holding each other, they were arranged in a very specific pattern. The older sister's index and middle fingers crossed deliberately over the younger sister's hand, while both thumbs were positioned at precise angles. It looked intentional, controlled, like a gesture carrying meaning beyond affection. Evelyn sat back in her chair, her pulse quickening slightly. She had studied enough about the Underground Railroad, about coded communication systems used by abolitionists and freedom seekers, to recognize when something deserved closer examination. This wasn't just a photograph. It might be a message. And if it was, she needed to find out what it said. Evelyn spent the next 3 days combing through every resource she could access on nonverbal communication systems from the Civil War era. She examined quilting patterns that supposedly contained directional codes for the Underground Railroad, though many historians debated their authenticity. She reviewed documented hand signals used by conductors to identify safe houses. She studied the language of flowers, the meaning embedded in hymns, the symbolism woven into everyday objects. But nothing matched the specific hand position in the photograph. Then she found a reference in an obscure 1987 academic journal by a historian named Dr. Lawrence Winters, who had spent decades researching lesser-known resistance networks in Philadelphia. In a footnote on page 43, he mentioned in passing that some Underground Railroad operatives had developed silent recognition signals, gestures that could be made in public without attracting attention. He noted that these signals were never written down, transmitted only through direct teaching, and lost to history when the generation that used them passed away. He had found only fragmentary evidence of their existence in letters and diaries, none describing the gestures in detail. But one letter, written by a Quaker abolitionist named Isaac Pemberton in 1864, contained a sentence that made Evelyn's breath catch: "The sisters have perfected a silent tongue spoken with hands alone, which identifies the faithful even in crowded rooms where enemies listen." The sisters, not a generic reference to female operatives, but specific individuals well enough known to Pemberton that he didn't need to name them. Evelyn cross-referenced the date and location. Pemberton had been active in Philadelphia throughout the 1860s, working closely with black conductors and free black communities to coordinate escapes from the South. Philadelphia, the same city where this photograph had been taken, according to the faint studio marking on the back, J. Wilson, photographer, Chestnut Street, Philadelphia, 1863. Evelyn felt the pieces beginning to align, though she couldn't yet see the full picture. She needed more. She needed to find out who these women were, what network they belonged to, and whether the hand gesture in the photograph was truly a coded signal or just a coincidence her imagination had inflated into significance. She reached for her phone and called a colleague at Howard University, a historian specializing in African American resistance movements. When he answered, Evelyn didn't waste time on pleasantries. She simply said, "I think I've found something that changes everything we know about the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. Can you come to Boston?" Dr. Marcus Reed arrived 2 days later, carrying a worn leather satchel and an expression of barely contained curiosity. Evelyn met him in the museum's climate-controlled research room, where she had set up her laptop alongside the original photograph, now sealed in an archival sleeve. Marcus leaned over the image for a long moment, his eyes moving between the sisters' faces and their intertwined hands. Then he straightened and pulled a battered journal from his satchel, handling it with the reverence reserved for fragile historical artifacts. The journal had belonged to Jeremiah Todd, a free black man who had operated as a conductor in Philadelphia from 1859 until his death in 1867. Marcus had studied Todd's writings for years, and much of what he'd found was routine documentation, names of safe houses, notes on supplies, records of people successfully guided to freedom. But there were entries that had always puzzled him, passages that seemed deliberately vague or coded in ways he couldn't decipher. Marcus opened the journal to a page marked with a red ribbon and read aloud, **, met with R&N today. They have learned the silent speech, a crossing of hands, a position of fingers. This will be our recognition in dangerous places. Let no word of this be written plainly, for if our enemies discover it, the path will close. R&N. **. The initials meant nothing on their own, but the date of the entry was June 1863, the same year as the photograph. And the description, a crossing of hands, a position of fingers, matched exactly what Evelyn had observed. Marcus looked at her steadily and said what they were both thinking: these two women in the photograph might be R&N, the sisters Jeremiah Todd had trained in the silent recognition code. If that was true, then this photograph wasn't just a portrait. It was documentation, proof that the code had existed, evidence of how it looked, and potentially a teaching tool shared with other operatives. But they still didn't know who R&N were. No full names appeared in Todd's journal, and the photographer's studio had closed decades ago, its records long since lost or destroyed. Evelyn and Marcus spent hours cross-referencing Todd's entries with other historical documents, church records, abolitionist society membership lists, census data from Philadelphia's free black community in the 1860s. Then Marcus found a letter tucked into the back pages of Todd's journal, written in a different hand. It was addressed to "My dearest Ruth," and signed simply N. The letter was brief, formal in tone, but its content was unmistakable. It spoke of a journey, of danger, of a promise to return. And at the bottom, a single line, asterisk, "When you think of me, remember our sign. It will keep you safe." Asterisk. Ruth and Naomi. The biblical names matched the initials, and suddenly the women in the photograph had identities. With names to work from, the research accelerated. Evelyn and Marcus combed through Philadelphia's historical records, searching for any mention of Ruth and Naomi connected to abolitionist activity in the early 1860s. What they found was fragmentary but compelling. In the membership register of Mother Bethel AME Church, one of the oldest African American churches in the United States, two women named Ruth and Naomi were listed in 1862 as participants in benevolent work, a common euphemism for Underground Railroad activity. No last names were recorded, typical for operatives protecting their identities. A letter from Lucretia Mott, a prominent Quaker abolitionist, mentioned meeting two remarkable young sisters in Philadelphia in 1863 who had risked everything to guide freedom seekers north. Mott didn't name them directly, but her description matched the time period and the level of involvement that Todd's journal attributed to R&N. Then Marcus found a reference in an 1863 federal marshal's report documenting the capture of Asterisk, a Negro woman approximately 20 years of age who had been apprehended near the Delaware border while guiding a family of freedom seekers. Asterisk, the woman had been returned to Maryland and sold back into slavery. No name was given, but the date was August 1863, just months after the photograph was taken. Could this have been Naomi? The timeline fit. The location matched routes Todd's journal indicated the sisters used. And there was one more piece of evidence, a letter written in 1866 discovered in the archives of Mother Bethel Church, signed by someone named Ruth. The letter was addressed to "all who remember," and spoke of a sister who had been lost, doing the Lord's work, who had given her life so others might be free. Ruth's letter didn't name Naomi directly, but the grief and reverence in the words made it clear this was a memorial, a way of ensuring that even without records or monuments, the sacrifice would not be forgotten. Evelyn stood in the archive room holding a photocopy of Ruth's letter and felt the full weight of what they had uncovered. The photograph showed two sisters in 1863, their hands clasped in a coded signal that meant safety, trust, and recognition among those fighting for freedom. Within months of that photograph being taken, one of them had been captured, enslaved, and likely killed. The other had lived on, continuing the work, carrying the memory, teaching the signal to others. The photograph wasn't just a portrait. It was the last image of them together, a message sent across time, waiting for someone to finally understand. Marcus and Evelyn worked with a team of historians, anthropologists, and nonverbal communication experts to reconstruct what the hand signal in the photograph actually meant. They studied every detail, the precise angle of the fingers, the pressure points where hands touched, the positioning of the thumbs. Then they cross-referenced this with fragmentary descriptions from abolitionist letters, church records, and oral histories passed down through descendants of Underground Railroad operatives. Slowly, the meaning emerged. The crossed fingers represented intersecting paths, the routes freedom seekers traveled. The older sister's hand over the younger symbolized protection and guidance, the experienced conductor leading the way. The positioning of the thumbs indicated direction, pointing subtly toward the North Star without a single spoken or written word. It was a complete message compressed into a gesture that could be made in seconds, in public, in front of those who would never recognize it for what it was. If two operatives met in a crowded market, on a street corner, even in the presence of slave catchers, they could identify each other with this sign, and no one else would know. But the code was more than just identification. According to one letter written by a conductor named Elizabeth Harris, the signal could be modified slightly to convey additional information. A different thumb angle meant danger, do not approach, fingers interlaced in reverse indicated safe house nearby, a brief touch of the wrist meant I have people who need passage. It was an entire language, tactile and silent, designed to operate in the most hostile environments imaginable. And it had worked. Records suggested that the network Ruth and Naomi were part of successfully guided hundreds of people to freedom between 1859 and 1865. The photograph served a dual purpose. On the surface, it was a formal portrait, the kind many families commissioned to mark important moments or simply to have a record of their existence. But for those who knew the code, the photograph was also a teaching tool, a way to pass the knowledge to new operatives, to ensure that even if the original practitioners died or were captured, the signal would survive. Ruth and Naomi had sat in that Philadelphia studio, positioned their hands with absolute precision, and created a document that would outlast them both. They had encoded resistance into a family photograph, hidden defiance in plain sight, and trusted that someday someone would look closely enough to see. In August 1863, Naomi was guiding a family of 5, a mother, her 3 children, and the mother's elderly father, along a route from Maryland through Delaware into Pennsylvania. It was one of the most dangerous crossings, heavily patrolled by federal marshals enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act and frequented by professional slave catchers who made their living tracking down fugitives from bondage. The route required mostly night travel, moving through dense forests and along riverbanks, avoiding roads and settlements where they might be seen. According to later testimony from one of the children who survived, they had been betrayed by an informant, a man who claimed to be part of the network but sold information to slave catchers for cash. The family was moving through a wooded area just south of the Delaware border when they were surrounded. Naomi tried to run, to draw the pursuers away from the family, but she was captured within minutes. The mother and children were also taken. Only the elderly grandfather escaped into the darkness, making his way north on his own and eventually reaching a Philadelphia safe house, where he told Jeremiah Todd what had happened. Todd recorded the incident in his journal with stark, grieving brevity, Naomi taken, the family lost, we have failed them. But then he added a line revealing the tragedy's depth, Ruth knows. She will not speak of it, but the light has gone from her eyes. Ruth had lost her sister, her partner in the work, the person with whom she had shared the silent language and the terrible burden of leading others toward freedom. And there was nothing she could do. Naomi had been returned to Maryland, sold to a plantation owner, and disappeared into the records of slavery that rarely documented individual lives except as property transactions. For Ruth, the photograph must have taken on new meaning after that day. It was no longer just a teaching tool or a record of their partnership. It was the last image of her sister as a free woman, the only proof that Naomi had existed, had mattered, had fought. Ruth kept the photograph for the rest of her life. When she died in 1889, it passed to her niece, who kept it hidden in a trunk for decades, protecting it from a world that wasn't ready to hear the story it contained. The photograph survived wars, fires, relocations, and the slow erosion of memory. And now, a century and a half later, it was finally being seen for what it truly was. As Marcus and Evelyn continued their research, they began mapping the full extent of the network Ruth and Naomi had been part of. Using Jeremiah Todd's journal, church records, abolitionist letters, and testimony from descendants of freedom seekers, they identified at least 30 documented cases where the silent hand code had been used to facilitate escapes between 1860 and 1865. The network operated across Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and New Jersey, with nodes in Philadelphia, Wilmington, Camden, and smaller towns along the routes. What made this network particularly effective was its secrecy and its reliance on black conductors who could move more freely through certain spaces than white abolitionists. Ruth and Naomi were part of a generation of free black women who used their positions as domestic workers, seamstresses, and laundresses to gather intelligence, pass messages, and coordinate escapes without arousing suspicion. They could enter white households, observe conversations, learn about slave catchers' movements, and relay that information back to the network. The hand code allowed them to communicate in front of their employers, on public streets, even in the presence of authorities, without ever speaking a word that could be used against them. The photograph also revealed something else. When Evelyn examined the studio backdrop more closely, she noticed faint markings on the painted wall behind the sisters, symbols that at first appeared to be decorative flourishes but, when compared with quilting patterns documented in other Underground Railroad research, matched known directional codes. The photographer, J. Wilson, may have been part of the network himself, using his studio as a safe space where operatives could document their work without fear. This wasn't unusual. Many businesses owned by free black individuals or sympathetic white allies served dual purposes, operating openly while secretly supporting resistance efforts. By the time Evelyn and Marcus completed their research, they had identified over 50 people connected to this specific network, including conductors, safe house operators, informants, and the freedom seekers themselves. Some names appeared in official records. Others existed only in coded references, initials and letters, unnamed figures in oral histories. But the photograph of Ruth and Naomi became the anchor point for all of it, the one piece of physical evidence proving the network existed, that the code was real, and that these women had done exactly what the fragmented record suggested, risked everything to guide others toward freedom. After Naomi's capture in 1863, Ruth continued the work alone. Records show she remained active in the Underground Railroad until the Civil War ended in 1865. And even after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, she continued helping formerly enslaved people navigate Reconstruction's dangers. She worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, taught literacy classes, and organized mutual aid societies in Philadelphia's black community. She never married. She never spoke publicly about her Underground Railroad work, but those who knew her described a woman of quiet strength and unshakable resolve. In 1870, Ruth opened a small boarding house for black women arriving in Philadelphia from the South, women fleeing violence, searching for work, or reuniting with family members. The house operated for nearly 20 years, providing refuge and support for hundreds of women during one of the most dangerous periods in American history for black communities. Ruth ran the boarding house until her death in 1889 at age 68. Her obituary in a black-owned newspaper described her as a woman of great dignity and faith, but made no mention of the Underground Railroad, the silent code, or the sister she had lost. The photograph remained in Ruth's possession until her death. It passed to her niece, who kept it carefully stored along with a handful of letters and the hand-stitched quilt Ruth had made in her later years, a quilt that Marcus and Evelyn later realized contained the same directional patterns they had seen in the studio backdrop. Ruth had continued encoding resistance even after the need for secrecy had passed, preserving the knowledge in fabric and thread for future generations. The quilt now resides in the Smithsonian's collection, displayed alongside the photograph, a testament to a woman who never stopped fighting. When Evelyn and Marcus presented their findings at a historical conference in 2014, they showed the photograph on a large screen, pointing out the hand position, the backdrop symbols, the precision of the composition. The audience sat in silence as the story unfolded, the code, the network, the capture, the survival. And when the presentation ended, a woman in the back row stood and asked if she could see the photograph up close. Her name was Clara Bennett. She was 73 years old, and she believed Ruth might have been her great-great-great-grandmother. Clara had grown up hearing stories about a woman in her family named Ruth who had done the Lord's work during the Civil War era. Her grandmother had told her that Ruth had a sister named Naomi who died young helping others, but no details were ever given. Clara had assumed it was just family mythology, the kind of stories passed down through generations that blur the line between fact and legend. But when she saw the photograph and heard the research Evelyn and Marcus had compiled, everything aligned. Clara provided genealogical records showing her family's lineage back to a woman named Ruth who had lived in Philadelphia and died in 1889. She also brought a small wooden box passed down through her family, containing a few personal items, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, a pressed flower, and a folded piece of paper with a hand-drawn sketch. When Evelyn examined the sketch, her breath caught. It showed two hands clasped together, fingers positioned in the exact configuration visible in the photograph. Below the drawing, in faded ink, were the words, "*Remember the sign. It kept us safe." This was Ruth's handwriting. Clara's family had been keeping this instruction, this piece of the code, for over a century without fully understanding what it meant. For Clara, the discovery was overwhelming. She had spent her entire life knowing she came from strong people, but she hadn't known how strong or what they had sacrificed. She stood in the museum's research room holding the photograph in her hands, looking at the faces of her ancestors, and wept. Evelyn and Marcus arranged DNA testing to confirm the connection, though the genealogical records were already convincing. The results came back positive. Clara was a direct descendant of Ruth, which meant she carried the bloodline of a woman who had helped guide hundreds of people to freedom, who had lost her sister to the cause, and who had lived the rest of her life honoring that sacrifice through service to her community. Clara became involved in the museum's efforts to share Ruth and Naomi's story, speaking at events, participating in educational programs, ensuring that her ancestors' names and actions were finally given the recognition they deserved. And the photograph. That faded daguerreotype taken in a Philadelphia studio in 1863 became one of the most significant artifacts in the museum's collection, not just because of what it showed, but because of what it represented, the ingenuity, courage, and resilience of people who refused to accept oppression, who created systems of resistance that operated invisibly within a society designed to crush them, and who left messages, in gestures, fabrics, and images, for future generations to decode. In 2015, the Boston Museum of African American History opened a permanent exhibit titled Silent Language: Codes of Resistance in the Underground Railroad. At its center was the photograph of Ruth and Naomi, enlarged, beautifully restored, with detailed explanations of the hand code, the network they belonged to, and the fates that awaited them after that photograph was taken. Beside the image were Ruth's quilt, Clara Bennett's family heirlooms, excerpts from Jeremiah Todd's journal, and letters from abolitionists describing the silent speech they had witnessed but never fully understood. Visitors came from across the country. Schoolchildren stood in front of the photograph studying the hand position, trying to replicate it with their own fingers. Historians debated the implications for Underground Railroad research. Descendants of other operatives contacted the museum sharing their own family stories, their own fragments of the code that had survived in whispers and gestures passed from parent to child. The photograph had opened a door, revealing a hidden dimension of resistance that had been erased from mainstream history. Clara Bennett, now in her 70s, became a regular presence at the museum, volunteering as a speaker and educator. She would stand beside the photograph of her great-great-great-grandmothers and tell their story, not with sadness, but with pride. She would demonstrate the hand signal, explaining its meaning, showing how something so small could communicate so much in an era when speaking the truth could cost your life. And she would end every talk the same way, they wanted us to remember. They left this message so we would know what they did, who they were, and what they stood for. And now we do. The photograph continues to be studied, analyzed, shared. It appears in textbooks, documentaries, academic papers. It has become an icon of resistance, a symbol of the intelligence and bravery that allowed the Underground Railroad to function even in the most hostile conditions. But more than that, it has become a reminder that history is not always written in words. Sometimes it is encoded in gestures, stitched into quilts, captured in the precise positioning of two sisters' hands as they sat for a photograph in 1863. Ruth and Naomi could not have known that their image would survive, that someone would eventually look closely enough to understand what they were saying. But they left the message anyway, trusting that someday someone would see. And in 2013, someone finally did. The silence was broken. The code was revealed. And two women who had been invisible for 150 years stepped out of history's shadows and into the light. Their hands still clasped together. Still speaking their silent language. Still saying, we were here. We fought. We mattered. Remember us, *. And now we do.